Welcome back! My name is Baller Scuba. This is Video Games Over Time. We are still in 1984. Today, we're going to take a look back at the year that was 1984 in a retrospective. If you haven't seen a retrospective before, it's just kind of my chance to just loosely talk about everything that happened this year, both on screen and behind the scenes, all that kind of stuff. I'm on my streaming setup, which I haven't been able to use in quite some time, so it's nice to kind of be back on this. I do have some stuff in the background, right? There's the cabinet that's kind of always in the background of the intros and stuff like that. As you can see, there's some changes. I already did a little bit of recording for 1985. I did have to hide some spoilers right there, that little white thing. Turn that around. Actors moved up to the top. They're pretty much done for the time being. Nobody ever caught that, I don't think. But anyway, I'm on my streaming setup. We're just going to loosely talk about things. I don't have a script. I just have a list of topics to talk about. I'm in my retrospective t-shirt that my mom got me. Thanks, Mom. I try to wear it every retrospective. I try not to do any kind of like advertising, but my mom got me this, so I always try to wear it for these. That's basically the setup. So we will start with the list of topics that we talked about this year. I have a list of all the videos, all the main topics that we talked about. We'll talk about a little bit behind the scenes, some things that I learned as we went, some personal stories that I might have about these, and we'll just kind of get into it. The first one that we did was Macintosh. Macintosh is obviously an Apple computer, as we talked about. I was kind of surprised to learn that the initial first Macintosh really didn't do well. That was kind of new information for me. I figured because the commercial did so well, the Macintosh must be amazing right out of the gate, sold well. That's not the case. In terms of personal experience, I have none with the original Macintosh or any of the ones that we have talked about to this point. So I can't really say much about the original Macintosh, but I will say that I do have experience with Apple products. We'll just go with that, and we'll just kind of move on from there, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when we actually talk about some of those computers. But essentially, kind of as a teaser, Apple does a really good job of getting their products into educational facilities. So when I was learning how to use computers in school, those were typically on Apple products. And we've talked about that a little bit. Like the Apple II was a very strong educational computer in America. So a lot of people grew up learning how to use computers through Apple IIs, not necessarily through the Macintoshes that have been released through 1984. All right, next topic is Sorcerer. Sorcerer, I always have to kind of remind myself about these games before I get started. Sorcerer, I do remember. It is the sequel to Enchanter, which itself is kind of the spiritual successor to the Zork trilogy. So Sorcerer is more or less like the fifth Zork game, if you want to look at it that way. It was fun. Never played it before. A lot of the text adventure games I just kind of skipped because by this point, right, there are more interesting games in terms of graphical appeal. There are graphic games that are starting to be adventure games as well, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But I didn't really go back to the old Infocom games ever before, so I'm excited to get that chance, and it's fun. I like the Infocom text-based games, but yeah, never had played that one before. A lot of people have asked like how long I'm going to stick with the Infocom games, and really, like, we've skipped a lot of Infocom games. It really depends on the game itself. It's not just, well, I can just ignore Infocom moving forward. That's not how it works. Next up, we do have Pitfall 2 Lost Caverns. I have to be very careful how I say it. It's Pitfall 2 Lost Caverns. There's no the. We'll get to that when we get to that. That'll be next year. But Pitfall 2 Lost Caverns is a game that I really hadn't heard of, but I am very happy that we went back and covered that because it was a very different experience from the original Pitfall. It is a game that if you remember, just basically has like a full-fledged story that you go through. There's a very kind of set pattern that you have to go through in order to beat Pitfall 2. Was it difficult? Sure. But because it didn't have any kind of end game if you died, like you could just keep going and going, it is a game that is easily beat. And so I beat it. And I'm happy I did that. And that's really kind of a first for us. There's, in terms of a platform game, you don't see that too often. Well, that's not true. This is why I have to say that I do things loose. I was thinking like, no, the Miner 2049er had an end, Manic Miner, there were a few games that had an end. But in terms of a console game, I should say, this was the first for us that had a kind of a beginning, middle, and end, and was just designed to be a beatable game. It wasn't just designed to keep you going over and over. It was designed around getting to the end and getting a high score at the end. So I'm glad that I covered that. It's kind of a mix of the transition there. The next video that we did was boxing, the history of boxing. That was interesting for me, and that was really difficult to edit. It was really hard to find clips of boxers trying to, like, especially when I was trying to talk about the techniques in boxing, it was really hard to find clips of people doing exactly what I was talking about. But overall, I think that was a good introduction to boxing. I haven't really talked about this before, but for a little bit, I was actually running a blog site. And the idea behind the blog site was trying to introduce sports to people that weren't necessarily familiar with it. And the idea was to try to talk to nerds in particular, because I'm a nerd. I think that's a term that doesn't really have a negative connotation anymore. So it was basically a nerd's introduction to sports. So this was kind of my first chance to really use that in these videos, some of the stuff that I learned there. So I think that I do a good job with the introductions to the sports. With that said, boxing will of course not be the last one that we talk about. So if you're not familiar with a lot of these sports, hopefully these introduction videos will help. And did I learn things? Sure. But I had already known a lot of these concepts. Of course, I knew who Muhammad Ali was, which was definitely a focus. When you're talking about the history of boxing through 1984, you have to talk about Muhammad Ali a lot. When he was there, like, he was the man, he was the biggest guy there. And as he left, he just kind of left this hole that hasn't been replaced by 1984. We'll put it that way. Keep in mind, though, that, just because I talk about people doesn't mean they're role models. Anyway, Punch-Out is next. Punch-Out, I hadn't played Punch-Out before. I've never even seen a Punch-Out cabinet before. That one's rare, and I think it's because it has the two screens on it, and that makes it difficult for arcade owners to want to invest in a more expensive cabinet. But I of course have played games similar to the original Punch-Out. It's fun to see the characters. The game is very difficult. It requires a lot of memorization, a lot of strategy, and a lot of practice. And I could only practice so much for each game. So I made it pretty far in that. I'm happy with how far I made it, but that game's fun, sure. Next up, we have Boulder Dash. Boulder Dash almost didn't make the cut this year, but Boulder Dash I felt was such a kind of iconic title that it was worthy of being mentioned. It's a weird one for me, though, because there's a lot of games that are similar to it. If you look back, it has a similar feel to me to Dig Dug in terms of going through going through the ground and then things falling on you and stuff like that. Of course, it's a much more comprehensive take on that. But Boulder Dash, there's a lot of people that love that game, but I just thought it was okay this year for me. It was fun, though. I had fun with it. Next up is Hero. Hero, I think some people don't even remember. Hero was kind of that platform game with the guy with the helicopter. You kind of go down and rescue some miners by touching them, basically, just like, and then they're out. Hooray, you did it. But overall, Hero was a fun game. It's one of a few console games that we have. I'm looking down my list. There's not a lot of console games here. There's just, yeah. Unfortunately, it was released on the Atari 2600, same as Pitfall 2. So it's, by 1984, anything released on the Atari 2600 is not going to be very successful, but they are good games and some of the best ones that we have seen on the Atari 2600 to date. At least in terms of original games. Ports are a whole different thing that I don't really need to go into. Next up, we have Sabrewulf. We'll start with the Ultimate Play the Games this year. Sabrewulf. Sabrewulf was a little fun. I wasn't a huge fan of it. The more that I'm playing the Ultimate Play the games, the less I'm liking the company. But overall, like the Saberman games, and Sabrewulf kind of in particular, because it's the first one, were what Ultimate Play the Game was known for back in the day. My dog's going to bark. I'm going to hold things for a little bit here. Don't worry, everyone. The dog protected me from the Amazon driver 3 houses down. Thank you, Ruby. All right, so Sabrewulf, once again, kind of the first of the Saberman games, and that's what Ultimate Play the Game is most known for. They were seen as really good. Of the games that we played from Ultimate Play the Game this year, Sabrewulf was probably my favorite, which is not saying much. I didn't have that much fun playing it, but it was important. It's one of the examples of how gaming attitudes have changed over the years, but we'll talk about that as we continue. Sabrewulf, kind of fun, uses pretty much the standard at this point ZX Spectrum Ultimate Play the Game graphics, but overall, decent. Needs fixing, though. Next up, we have Duck Hunt. Duck Hunt is the first one, I think. Yes, the first one this year that I have extensive amounts of personal experience with. We'll talk about how that is eventually, but yeah, I've played a lot of Duck Hunt. The game is, I have to say it real slow. Duck Hunt. We had the light gun. I still have to call it that. I want to call it something else. We had the light gun. It never aligned properly, so just like everybody else, eventually you're just putting that thing up against the screen and you're just like, there, and it still didn't work. Like, those things broke so much. But I had a lot of fun playing that as a kid. Somebody did point out that the amount of ducks that you need to shoot in order to move on to the next level is actually forecasted on the bottom of the screen. I didn't find that information anywhere. I played it a lot growing up. I didn't know that. Then again, back then I didn't read instructions or anything like that. No. Next up, we have King's Quest. King's Quest, I believe that I have played before, but I definitely haven't made it to the end before, because there was definitely some stuff at the end that I'm like, I don't remember having to do this at all. But King's Quest, a lot of fun. That game I would recommend to everybody. That might be one of the highlights of the year, I think, kind of across the board. That one is a graphic adventure game. We'll be seeing a lot of people trying to adopt that. We'll be seeing some stuff. King's Quest is very influential, so I'm looking forward to seeing what comes of King's Quest. But ultimately, that one's a lot of fun. Next up, we have Hypersports. Hypersports, I hadn't played before, hadn't really heard of it before I started doing this series. But it's a sequel to Track and Field, which I had heard of. It's in the arcade. It's considered good, all that kind of stuff. To me, it just kind of feels like more of the same from Track and Field. It didn't feel all that different to me, but it was important to just kind of talk about because, you know, they're important, influential, popular, all that kind of stuff. Next up, we have Karate Champ. Now, Karate Champ, I believe, is the first fighting game that we have done. The first one that's kind of considered a fighting game. We'll talk a little bit more about genres as we continue, but Karate Champ is fun. It just kind of feels like a karate tournament, and that's always going to be at least a little bit entertaining That one, I don't know. There's not a lot to it because it's kind of the first fighting game, so there's just not a lot going on there. But ultimately, it's fun. Hadn't played it before, and it's always nice to play something I hadn't played before. Before this series, at least. I should say that I always try to at least get a little bit of practice in before I record myself. My goal is always to just kind of do an average run. I don't want to make it appear like this is the first time I've ever touched the game when I play it, but I'm also not trying to show off and show like the best possible run, because that's not how the game normally gets played. You know, if you're playing a game for the first time or you've played it for a little bit, you're not going to do the best possible run, and I don't think it's fair to the game to just kind of do the best possible run through it. Like, oh, here's a speed run, here's a whatever. You're just kind of looking at what the game is supposed to be played like, what it's actually played like, all that kind of stuff. So never really my goal to do, you know, the best run ever. Next up, we have Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, the film. That is something that I'm sure I saw. I'm sure I've seen it. I went through the Indiana Jones series at one point, just fully. I will say not my favorite of the Indiana Jones films. I like Raiders better. But it's still a good film. I think it's just a little off compared to the original. I like the original, but I know a lot of people like Temple of Doom better. Like, it's just a matter of opinion. So sure, I've seen it. I don't have too many big stories about that. There's not a lot of stories behind the scenes on that one. Not like Raiders of the Lost Ark, where George Lucas comes across very creepy. Had to include that tidbit. Still talking about that one. Next up, we have Jet Set Willy. Jet Set Willy I've heard about a lot, but this was my first chance to be able to actually get in and play it thanks to this series, and it's one of the points of the series. Like, let's play some games that I've always wanted to and never had kind of the excuse to, or however you want to phrase it. Jet Set Willy, like, really hard. Like, you take all the kind of minor games that we had been playing, like Miner 2049er and Manic Miner, and you just step that up, and now we're doing even harder. Like, that was... Some of those British computer platform games are really difficult, and I don't know why. And it's like, it doesn't have a control scheme that warrants that kind of difficulty. I don't feel confident enough in my jumps and everything for you to be that difficult. But Jet Set Willy was definitely a little bit too difficult for my tastes. Next up, we have Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. One of my mom's favorite movies, actually. But Star Trek 3, good film. I have seen it before. I went through all the Star Treks at some point, too. The third one, I don't know. Not necessarily my favorite. There's kind of a joke in the Star Trek fandom that only the even ones are good. We'll see about that. But definitely 2 was the best one for me. This one was not as good as Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, but a lot better than the first one for me, Star Trek the Motion Picture. But then again, I'm not a huge fan of the 2001 A Space Odyssey style. I like visuals, but I don't need to watch it for 5 to 10 minutes straight. That's just me. So, good film. But we have seen better Star Trek. Not the most influential Star Trek film, but the fact that Spock comes back, I mean, even the title gives it away, the spoiler. I don't know how to feel about that. I think ultimately it was the right decision, but there was an opportunity there for them to move on, but Leonard Nimoy is just too good. He's too good. Next up, we have the Tower of Druaga. Now, this is going to be the first game, I think the first game. Yeah, this is the first game that we're going to kind of talk about ports and the importance of ports. The original arcade game, a lot of fun. That one's good. The Tower of Druaga eventually gets a port that's a little bit more infamous because it was released on a very popular platform. We'll just phrase it that way for now. And that port wasn't very good. Bottom line. And so a lot of people then retroactively say that the arcade game wasn't very good. That is not the case. The Tower of Druaga arcade game was very good, I would say. One of the better arcade games that we've played this year. I was trying to look for my awards, see if I wanted to phrase it that way, but I can't even see my awards. I don't remember what I put there, but that's already determined. The Tower of Druaga is a good arcade game, and it's worthy of paying attention to. It's one of the, if not the first action RPG. It really depends. Like, we'll talk more about genres later, but it is considered an action RPG. You have a character that powers up, but there's no turns. You're just kind of running around smacking people with your sword. Like, that's a very good imitation of how Gilgamesh works. But the Tower of Druaga, very good game. Don't skip out on it just because you've heard rumors of it being bad, because a lot of games at this time are considered bad because of ports that came later. And that particular port, I didn't look up that one, but that one comes out, it'll take a few years for that to come out. And by that point, it's not necessarily that people have moved on to something better, but the platform that it's released on couldn't handle the full game, is the way that I'll phrase it for now. Next up, we have the Ghostbusters film. Ghostbusters, one of my favorite films from not only the year, but the 1980s as a whole. It's so good. I've heard people refer to it as the perfect film. It's a perfect film, just because there's nothing that they would change. I think there's a couple things that I would change in it. I don't think there's such a thing as a perfect film. So ultimately, it's really good. I have seen it several times. I really enjoy it. I think that the humor in it is very good. I think the plot is good. Even the what would you call it? The special effects, I guess. I mean, they're practical. So today we would call it like practical effects, but in the 80s, the special effects still very good. The creatures hold up very well. The costumes and all that. It's a good film. If you haven't seen it, go see it. Like there's no reason not to watch Ghostbusters. I think it's very good. Next up, we have Tetris. Tetris, of course, I've played. I don't think anybody that has played video games for more than like 5-10 years can say that they've never played some version of Tetris. It's a little funny thing, I guess. I do need to address it. But when I scripted and recorded and all that for Tetris, everything that I saw said it was released in 1984. I even had a specific date. I believe it was July 1st, 1984. Like, boom, that's when it was released. Well, Alexei Pajitnov has done some interviews where he vaguely just like, I think it was 1985. So now the consensus seems to be that, like, literally in the time that it took between me scripting and recording and now, the consensus has changed so that it might be 1985 when it was first put onto the computers in the Institute, and his coworkers were playing it. Ultimately, it doesn't change the story all that much, but it makes it so I put it in the wrong year. And there's a chance that some of the dates that I put into that video are now considered off. But once again, we're talking about somebody remembering things based on the interviews I saw anywhere between 20 and 40 years earlier, of him trying to remember exactly the date that one of his games were finished and he showed his coworkers to it. So ultimately it doesn't really matter, but you know, it could move things around. But Tetris as a whole, I've played so much of it. This was the first time I went back to the original version. The original version, I think, needs some tweaks. Like, there are some things about the game that kind of need to be changed. And I'm hoping that I get a good chance to show off some of the other versions of Tetris that do make those improvements. I will say that, a little bit of a spoiler, but in 1985, we're not going to talk about Tetris. There's nothing really going to happen in Tetris, so it'll take a couple years. Like, right now, at the end of 1984 or 1985, depending on, the source that you believe, Tetris is still very much stuck in the Soviet Union. There's a lot of legal issues that the Soviet Union didn't really have clear-cut laws on how to deal with when it comes to like intellectual property, video games, stuff like that. So it's going to be a bit of a legal battle to get it out of the Soviet Union, to try to figure out what that process even looks like to get it to Western computers and in video game stores. So we'll continue to talk about that, but it doesn't happen in 1985. So don't think I've forgotten about it. Just take some time. Next up, we have The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I actually own this book. I'm trying to think where it would be. It would be over there in the other closet. That's where we keep the books. One of my favorite books. I love those books. I've read them. I'm trying to think what to say about it, because I believe there were 4 books released by 1984. The series does continue. I would say the first 3 books, really good. The 4th one, but to tell if you would like it, feel free to read the first paragraph. The first paragraph is one of my favorite opening paragraphs of any books ever. But I learned quite a bit about The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because to me it felt like halfway between like Monty Python and Doctor Who. And so to find out that Douglas Adams, I blinked on his name for a second there, Douglas Adams had written for both Monty Python and Doctor Who, just made all the sense in the world to me. So if you like, some stuff from Monty Python, and you like some stuff from Doctor Who, old Doctor Who for people today, then check out The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You'll see some stuff that you enjoy there. There's a reason that he was successful in both. Then, of course, we played The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy video game, which I had not played before. I do like some of the things about it. There's a lot to like there. I think some of the humor was missed. I think that, especially with a text-based adventure game, you have the opportunity to bring literally the passages from the book into the game, and some of that missed the mark for me. But otherwise, it was still funny. It's still good. I wish that they did more. I wish that it went through the entirety of the first book, at least. I should point out with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I've never listened to the original broadcast. That's probably something I should do at some point, because I know there are some changes between the radio broadcast and the book, but never went back and listened to those. Probably worth checking out, considering I am a fan. But yeah, the computer game could have been better, but overall solid. Very good. I have no issues with that one. Next up, we have Impossible Mission, which I had heard vaguely about before this, but never got the chance to really delve into it before this. I don't think I even really knew what it was. But yeah, it's a combination of, I would say, kind of a platform game mixed with some strategy that you have to use involved in it. It's an interesting game and one worth checking out, but with that said, it was very difficult, to the point that there were certain rooms that I looked at and I'm like, I don't know how to solve this room. My character has a very specific jump pattern, and I don't see how I can get up there with his jump pattern. But a lot of people really like Impossible Mission. Of course, if I had a ton more time, like weeks more time to practice Impossible Mission, maybe we could have done better at it and I could show how to actually get through that kind of stuff. But by the time I did, I feel like I did a decent run. I got to showcase a lot of it, but ultimately, once again, British platform games, they're very difficult. I'm not sure why the difficulty on those particular games are so high. Next up, we have The Lords of Midnight, which is something I had not heard of. This is one of a couple games that I had a couple people, well, one person in particular, kind of ask, why did I do this game? And the ultimate answer is that in 1984, it was considered one of the best games of all time. And once I see like, hey, this is one of the best games of all time, even if I've never heard of it, I'm going to check it out. And once I checked it out, I realized, hey, this is something new and different, and the quality is good. This is worth paying attention to, even if it's a flash in the pan in 1984. So that was kind of the reasoning there. Anyway, The Lords of Midnight, once again, never heard of it, was really happy to get into it. And it kind of represents a genre that we have not talked that much about, but has been behind the scenes in video games. And that would be the war gaming genre, let's call it that. Because once again, like I want to call it strategy games, and that kind of starts in 1984, the term strategy games, but it's really 1985 when people start using that a little bit more often. But it is a war gaming game. And once again, there's a ton of them behind the scenes, but this one I think was very different. It didn't play like Eastern Front with this top-down perspective, and you basically have more or less chess or a checkerboard pattern where you're moving your troops, your army across the map. That's not how the Lords of Midnight work. It's a first-person perspective. You get to see the landscape and all that. It had a technique that was new that is still used to this day to have techniques go. I believe that it's called billboarding today, and I'm trying to think what he called it before. I can't remember the other name for it, but he had a different name for it. But he basically invented it. Whether he was the first person to do it, I can't find a ton of information on that, but it seems that he's the first person to talk about it, and it, once again, still used today. So, very good game, worth checking out. I had somebody come onto that video. Apparently, they host a multiplayer online version of Lords of Midnight, and it's still going. So that person, he's like, yeah, I forget what it's like when you don't have the map memorized. I'm like, yeah, I don't have it memorized. And I had to continually look at the map and go like, where am I? Okay, I'm over here. Which way am I facing? All right, go 4 that way. And apparently once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy to beat. But I clearly did not get the hang of it. I did what I could. I think that was my 3rd run of the game. It's a long game, so it took a little bit for me to figure out what was going on. But ultimately that is a fun game, well worthy of attention. I wish that it got more attention in kind of video game press as a whole than it does now, because as we'll talk about, it's basically a British computer game, and British computer games didn't really see all that much outside of England, and this was definitely a victim of that. It wasn't from a huge publisher, so it kind of just fell to the side, but it's worthy of talking about and paying attention to. Next up, we have Balloon Fight. Now, Balloon Fight, I have played at some point. I don't remember. I probably was really young when I first played it. This was the first time playing the original for me. Personally, it's hard not to compare it to Joust. And I think I talked about that in my review. I think I prefer Joust. It just felt better. The controls just felt better for me. But Balloon Fight, it's Nintendo's answer. It's a good game, and it's worthy of checking out, at least becoming a little bit familiar with the characters in it. Next up, we have Super Punch-Out. Super Punch-Out is honestly one of the more obscure Punch-Out games, as it turns out. That was kind of new to me. Of course, I'd heard about Punch-Out and played a version of Punch-Out at some point, but Super Punch-Out, it's mostly notable for the characters, and that's why I talk about the games. I talked about that game in particular. It's worthy of talking about the characters. Kind of gave me the chance to point out a character based on Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan, even though it didn't feel right to really delve into those people yet at that point. But I did consider it. Hey, maybe now's the time to talk about Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan, but didn't feel quite right. But the characters are there, and they're interesting, and some of them I feel are, they didn't age very well. as stereotypes are becoming more and more of a hot topic. The Punch-Out series using stereotypes, you know, I'm sure they didn't mean any harm by it, and they were just trying to have comical characters. And I think that it's cartoonish enough to still get away with that. And I think I talked about that before. Next up, we have Elite. Elite, in particular, just Elite, I had not heard of, but I have heard of other games that were very similar. So going back and finding Elite, I think definitely worth talking about. This was another game that, for whatever reason, people thought I shouldn't have talked about, but this game in particular, absolutely. Like, there's no doubt I needed to talk about Elite. This game makes best games of all time list. Like, just because it was released in a market that you're not familiar with or stuff like that, like, no, it's still really good. And I would say it was a really good game. This, of any of the games that I have played this year, I probably didn't get a chance to showcase as much as I could or I wanted to. But ultimately, the game is really hard. The control scheme in particular was very difficult, and I think with 2 fixes, both of which were purchasable in the game, but I couldn't find cheats for it. Otherwise, I would have purchased the cheats, and then we could have had a good run. For whatever reason, the version that I have, the save didn't work, and that kind of threw things off, and I'm like, well, now I'm not sure how much I'm going to be able to do. But the control scheme, and let me try to illustrate again. There's basically 3 ways to control a flying craft, and those were referred to as pitch, which is up and down. There's roll, which is angles, and yaw, which is side to side. Now, most games do pitch and yaw. Like Star Raiders, for instance. That was pitch and yaw. In Elite, you're doing pitch and roll. I've never seen a game that only had those 2. Never. I don't enjoy it. Maybe there's some flight simulators that do, but because of the way that airplanes work in the, on Earth, when you go like this, you also go that way because of air pressure. But because there's no air pressure in space, going like this just means you're looking this way now. Now you're just going like that. You're not actually going to the left. So it became very difficult to maneuver in Elite. So let's say I wanted to go down and to the left, right? I wanted to go this way. In order to do that, I would have to roll this way, go down, and then roll the other way, and then I could go that way. Like that, it took a lot of thinking just to maneuver in the game, and that was my main complaint. Like, if we fix that, it's a so much better game for me. But if you can get used to that, then the game has a lot to offer, and that's the main thing. I also got complaints. There were 2 main complaints that I got about Elite. One was that I didn't show off the jump. That is something that I knew existed in the version that I had, but it didn't have the original. It wasn't in the original version, right? I linked to the website where they still have the manual and all that. Jump is not in the original version of the game, but in the later DOS version that I was playing, which I think was a 1988 version, they had added a jump mechanic so that after you basically hyperspaced into a sector, you could jump to the planet a little bit faster. Now, if I had made it further in the game, I did plan on showing that off, but I was trying to show off the original. I think we only did like 3, we made it to like 3 other planets, we only did like 3 trips basically. So it didn't feel right for me to show off a quality of life improvement that didn't exist in the game that I was talking about. But, should I have made it further, I would have shown that off. So I was aware, I just wasn't talking about it yet because as far as I can tell, it's not in the original version. And I think I found like 2 or 3 things to back me up on that. The other complaint was that my docking technique was terrible. My argument against that would be the fact that you even have to have a docking technique. shows that should be fixed. And once again, that was something that you could purchase to upgrade and just automatically dock, which I would argue should have been the case from the very beginning. But for those of you that didn't see, the stations basically would rotate, and you would have to match the rotation as you tried to dock. It is known to be a very difficult thing to do. The manual tells you that you have to, you should practice that before you do anything else, because there's no point in spending 20 minutes trying to get to the next planet only to not be able to dock at the station and die. So just go out, turn around, and see if you can do that. I should say turn around, because that's how you have to turn around in the game. But overall, like I said, even if I wasn't particularly good at the game, and I'm not, the game had so much. It was an open world, what we would call now a sandbox game. You could go out in space trade and space mine and do the bounty hunting and stuff like that. And the bounty hunting is actually how I made most of my money in the runs that I did. A lot of fun, that game, but a lot of frustration. And if I could find the cheats to let me purchase the upgrades specifically to get the yaw control and to automatically dock, completely different game, and might have been my favorite game of the year. But spoilers, it's not, because it was so frustrating for me. But yes, there were some complaints that I wasn't good at the game, which I wasn't. But definitely worthy of talking about. Like I said, it's a very interesting game, definitely changed things. Another game that had a British company do some technical improvements that hadn't been seen before with the hidden line removal on vector graphics. Very, very important game that I wish I could play better, but God, is it frustrating. Next up, we have Ice Climber. Ice Climber, I think I've played it before. It's one of those games that a lot of people think they've played, and then you get into it and it's a little weird. The jumping on the arc is so steep as opposed to what you're used to, right? Just almost straight up and down. It just takes some time getting used to it. But I believe I've played it before. The characters are very important. It's a fun game. Just takes some getting used to. You have to get over that initial difficulty curve, and I'm still not entirely sure I actually did that. Next up, we have Yie Ar Kung Fu. This almost didn't make my list, but when you look at the history of fighting games, this is often seen as the first fighting game. A lot of people put this one first, and I'm not sure why, because Karate Champ, I believe, came out first. I don't have dates in front of me, but I believe that one came out first. And Yie Ar Kung Fu, I think it might be considered the first fighting game because it has the health bar. Once again, we'll talk about genres a little bit later, but this one is fun. I feel that it's a bit unfair, and I think I talked about that before. Everybody else has better moves than I do. And I looked back, and there might have been a move that I had with a little bit more range than the one that I was using, but at the end of the day, range was king in that game. And they had the ability to throw stuff at me, and I didn't have the ability to throw stuff at them. So, fun game. Still, not even a little. Still rough around the edges. Needs improvement. But still fun for 1984. 1984 standards. Good game. Modern, not so much. Ghostbusters video game is next. Now, this is the second game that we're going to talk about that gets a bad reputation, and I don't think it necessarily deserves that. I think the game is fun. Is it repetitive? Yes. Without a doubt, it's repetitive. And I still couldn't quite figure out the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man and the technique for that. I've gotten conflicting reports even from what I've been able to find online, comments that I've gotten. But the Marshmallow Man, if I could have figured that out, I would have won, right? But I ended up having to cheat in order to win that one. But it's still a fun game. I'm a big fan of business simulation games. We'll end up talking about that more as the genre develops. But the Ghostbusters video game, I think, was a good kind of first start of a business simulation style game where you're running a business. You need to make money. Why you need to have more money to be able to pay off a loan in full. I'm an accountant. That's not how loans work. You don't hoard money and then pay off the full amount all at once. It's like, I could have made the monthly payments game. I could have. But no, that's not how the game worked. But otherwise, it's fun. It's just repetitive. It takes, I think I was doing it in about 20 minutes, the full game. Maybe it was like 40. Maybe I'm remembering wrong. But it doesn't take too long. You could do the whole thing in a sitting. And, you had the music. So if you love the music of the game, if you're a big fan of Ghostbusters, check it out. Check out the original. This one had a bad port. And people look at that bad port and go, see, look, the game's bad. Doesn't mean the original's bad. In particular, there's one scene that is added, and that scene was not programmed well. But we'll talk about that when that comes out, which I don't want to spoil too much, but I believe it's like 89. Like, it's late. Like, it comes out way later than it should. There's better games by the time that one comes out. Like, that's one of the issues, and we'll talk about that more. But once again, just because it's got a bad port doesn't mean it's a bad game. Next up, we have The Terminator. The Terminator, the film, one of the most iconic films of the 80s. And I'm a huge fan of it. I do like the original Terminator. I think Arnold Schwarzenegger does a great job, much better than O.J. Simpson would have done. But yeah, that film, very good. We're continuing to see Arnold Schwarzenegger just kind of be a main big star name in not only Hollywood, but in kind of video game culture. And The Terminator is no exception, because it was, you might even call it an indie film, The Terminator. It's a low budget film, at least. It's definitely from a director who didn't have a good track history. This is kind of his first big film, right? And he argues his first film. It didn't come with a lot of fanfare, so like it's good. Check it out. Terminator is a good film. Watch it. Next up, we have Pac-Land. Pac-Land I had heard about so much, and I was excited to get, once again, the opportunity to do the original version, which is the better version. This one doesn't have as much of a reputation, but once again, bad port for that game. We'll talk about it when it comes out. But Pac-Land, it's a defining moment in popular platform games. Just go to the right, jump, basically. And that's an important thing to notice, and it's from one of the biggest names in video games at the time. It stars Pac-Man. So it's worth checking out. I had never gotten the chance to play it, but I had heard about it so much, and so I was excited to do it. So I'm dreading going to the next topic. All right, next topic is Underworld. Underworld. Game's bad. I don't understand this one. The game is bad. I'm not going to mince words on that one. It's a bad game. 1984, modern, doesn't matter. It's a bad game. The reason that I played it, number one, is that it was a Saberman game from Ultimate Play the Game, and those two things are important. They're important to British video gaming history, and we'll talk about why Ultimate Play the Game is more important later. But Saberman is what they were known for. I would argue that A Tick Attack was their best game. That was the one I liked the most. But they were more known for Saberman, and Saberman was considered the better games. We had, and it just kind of makes me go like, what is the British video game journalists, what are they doing? If you're going to consider Underworld the best game that Ultimate Play the Game had released, like, what are you doing? I believe they did Jetpack. I know they did A Tick Attack. I would even say Saberwolf was better than Underworld. Underworld, you basically jumped and hoped that you landed where you were supposed to. Like, everything was just so random in that game. that like I didn't want to I had a guide in front of me. It said go this way, so I did. It didn't work out, and I was not interested in giving it another shot. And that was the only guide I could really find. But yeah, that was bad. And I kind of knew going in, like, this might be bad. So I thought about putting it in an honorable mention video instead. But since it came out basically at the same time as Night Lore, it ended up being the double feature. But God, that game was bad. It might be the worst game that we've done to this date. Like, worse than E.T. by a mile. E.T., like, you could at least beat if you knew what you were doing. Underworld, I'm like, this is just hope that things work out for you. That's how you beat the game. Night Lore is next. Night Lore, also quite a disappointment for me. I did not have a lot of fun playing Night Lore. I thought it was a game that I could beat. I had all the information that I thought I needed in front of me, and granted, I kind of did, but I still like struggled and couldn't get through certain rooms. Like I was even cheating to try. Well, not cheating because technically the game allowed it. No, it was cheating, and I still couldn't do it. That game was. The platforming in it needed a lot of work. The programming needed some work. But the reason that I did it, once again, Saberman Ultimate play the game. They're important. We might not see it yet, but it's important. And Night Lore was considered one of the best games of all time when it was released. And it would continue to make lists. But once again, it was mostly a British computer game. So I hadn't heard about a lot of these British computer games before. And they typically don't make American lists because people in America hadn't heard of it or thought about it. But that's it. A Tic Tac. It was still the better one. Similar, but Night Lore had the better technical aspects of it. They were doing isometric. The graphics were probably better, but A Tic Tac for me is the much better game to play. I favor the gameplay over the graphics because the graphics are still dated. Next up, we have Kung Fu Master. Kung Fu Master is a fun game. This is considered the first beat 'em up. Once again, we'll talk more about genres, but between Ye Are Kung Fu and Kung Fu Master, I had the chance to talk about Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan, both of which are going to be very influential. Bruce Lee, more of as a legend and as a character. Jackie Chan, still kind of starting out in 1984. He's been in a few movies. He's made a name for himself, but you can tell there's still a lot to come from Jackie Chan. He's still young, and as long as there's not something tragic like there was with Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan will probably continue to make an influence. So I was happy to talk about those two. Between Muhammad Ali and Bruce Lee, we're basically talking about two of the biggest names in the 70s of like cool guy that people wanted to be. So I was happy to be able to talk about that, even though I talked about it in the 80s. They are kind of the epitome of cool in the 70s in terms of like physicality, I guess you could say. I would say outside of sports, but Muhammad Ali is sports, so I don't know. But happy to talk about that. Kung Fu Master, very important game. Once again, we'll talk about genres and all that kind of stuff. But that one was fun. It was fun. Difficult because the character doesn't move as quickly as I would like, so it's hard to dodge and attack the way that I wanted and all that kind of stuff. But fun game. Definitely by 1984 standards. Excitebike is next. This was one of the few games that was kind of originally released for the Famicom. We've talked about a lot of ports to this point, and even Nintendo is releasing stuff as Versus in the arcades. And I know a lot of people are looking at those games going, "No, that's a Famicom game." No, it's originally an arcade game. They kind of just designed both at the same time. We'll talk about that more next year, but the way that Nintendo basically thinks about it is the Versus arcade games and the Famicom games, they can make both of those at the same time because it's using the same hardware. So essentially it is one game that they're programming, maybe a few tweaks here and there. But where they release it first kind of determines how I'm talking about it. But for them, they know they're going to release it at both places. That's the way the Versus system kind of works. Once again, we'll go much more into detail into that in 1985. But Excitebike, technically, on the Famicom first. And it's a fun game. I like it. Do I wish that I could be better at it? Sure. I'm not very good at the racing against other computers aspect of it. I'm much better just by myself, just kind of coasting through it. But that's a fun game. I enjoy Excitebike. I believe I've played it before. I think when I played it before I was a kid and I didn't fully understand the overheat mechanic of it, and I would hit the button that would make you go faster and then go, why am I stopped? I think I was real young when I played that one. Next up, we have 1942. 1942 is a very interesting game for me. I actually do have quite a bit of experience with this one in a kind of remake emulation, I guess you could say, format of it. I played it on a platform that doesn't exist in 1984. I might talk about that platform. It's an interesting platform. Let's just say I played it on a computer. We'll call it that. I think we will eventually have to talk about that platform. I'm trying to think of some of the original games that were released on that, but that platform basically, it was a monthly subscription, and then there were a lot of free games that you could play on it, and then there were other games that you had to purchase. You had to purchase on top of that, and I experienced a lot of these older games that way, and 1942 is one of them. With that said, I'm still not particularly good at it. I prefer having more power-ups in my shooters, but this is the first one that we really went through that I think put together a lot of what we were seeing in other games, that what they were trying to do between like Galaga and Space Invaders. I think 1942 might be my favorite to this point in terms of a shooter. It's good. Like I like having the upgrades. I like how realistic everything looks. Everything I think has dated well in that game. I really like it as a shooter. It might be just because I played it when I was a teenager on that platform that I was talking about, but ultimately, that my opinion is that it's a really good shooter. Might be my favorite to this point. Next up, we have Hydlide. Now, Hydlide is somehow a legendary game. I'm not sure how that really happened, but, well, I do. The reason that Hydlide is legendary is that a lot of people consider it legendarily bad. And I don't. I think that the original version is a good, solid RPG. Is it my favorite RPG? No. No. But the game is still going through the process of trying to figure out how to do a more traditional RPG like Ultima or Wizardry. And even though he says he had never heard of those, he was influenced by the games that were influenced by it. So like it was still loosely based on Ultima and Wizardry. And he's trying to combine that with more action like the arcade games. Now, clearly he had already seen the Tower of Jiraga. We'll even talk a little bit about Dragon Slayer a little bit later. But Hydlide in 1984, I think, is a game that is good in terms of it being more of a prototype or an indication of things to come. It's good for the time. The reason that it gets a really bad reputation is that the only North American release of it happens in, I believe, 1989. I remembered it was 5 years, so let me double check my math. I believe that is 1989. 5 years in video games in the 80s is a huge deal. So by the time that got released in North America, there were much better games, right? And it got hyped a bit. And so people went back to it and were like, no, this game is terrible. I even got a comment that like basically Hydlide, he was crude about it, but basically Hydlide was the worst game of all time. It's absolutely not. It is a decent to good game. And I would say good in 1984. But by the time that it's released in North America, 5 years is a huge difference. I mean, think back, we'll talk about it more, but don't judge, once again, the original version based on, it's not even a bad port, it's just a port that was terrible timing. I mean, I would say that even 3 years in video games at this time is like death. Like, don't wait 3 years to release a game. Now it's bad. Like, and for it to be 4 years later, and that's like the first release and your first exposure to it, it's a completely different take on the game. But highlight overall, I think it's a good game. Like I said in my review of it, it's not balanced right. I need to be able to heal faster. Grinding shouldn't take as long as it does. There's a couple things that I would fix in terms of puzzle solving and stuff like that, but ultimately it's still a good game. And we did way more grinding than that in the Wizardry games. Way more. And Wizardry doesn't get the reputation that Hydlide gets, which is, oh, it's basically level grinding the game. There's a lot of it. I'm not going to deny that, but we did way more than that in older games. Like, it's still improving in terms of that. It's just that, you know, gaming tastes changed by 1989. Next up, we have Karateka. Now, Karateka is an interesting game, mostly because it's going to fuel a lot of the genre thing that I'm going to talk about in a bit, but Karateka is a fun game. It's a little stilted, but that's because of the rotoscoping, I think. And the rotoscoping is the highlight of it. The graphics look great for 1984. Are they dated? Of course they are. Anytime you try to do something realistic in an older game, it's going to look dated. It's just the nature of it. You want more of a cartoon style if you want things to last. But Karateka is a fun game. It's stilted. That's my only complaint about it. It takes a little bit for the character to do what I asked him to do. That's about it. Next up, but ultimately, yeah, fun game. Definitely worth checking out. We'll hear from Jordan Mechner again. There's a reason I said it. If you're a fan of Jordan Mechner, well, people aren't going to be a fan if it's just that one game, right? Next up, we have Marble Madness. Marble Madness, for the record, Hydlide and Karateka I had always heard of, but I had never played before. Marble Madness, I had played before. I had actually played this one in the arcade at one point with the trackball and everything. And like I said in the video, trackballs, your fingers just get pinched, like right on the side. You're like, ow. Like every time. So I don't necessarily like the trackball controls. I was happy to just have a little joystick instead. But Marble Madness, it's a solid game. It's a fun game. The only problem, just like people had at the time, is it's short to only have 6. And for me, on my like third or fourth run that day, after a little bit of practice, to be able to go over halfway through the game, like, it's a short game. And once you get through it, you're probably not going to want to go back too much to it. It doesn't have a lot of replay value, I think, personally. Like, once you get through all 6, like, okay, I'm done, and you move on. But overall, solid game. So those are the main topics that we talked about this year. There were a lot of them, and I realize that I'm probably over an hour into this video, and we got a ways to go. Like I said, this is going to be a long one. I'm not trying to keep it short. I'm trying to fully talk about everything I wanted to talk about. So as I had talked about a lot during the breakdown of those videos, let's talk about genres. New genres are starting to form, is what I wrote. Many are hard to define at the time. That is definitely a big thing to talk about. So looking through my list again, we have new games in the form of fighting games. We have a new genre called beat 'em up, which doesn't really exist in 1984, but people credit it that way. And then we have action RPGs. Now, the differences in 1984 are so hard to define. I would argue that genres are constantly being redefined as the form kind of develops. And I don't think it's necessarily fair to apply a modern term to an old game. So looking at something like action RPG, what does that really mean? It's hard to define that. What is that versus a turn-based RPG? That's the first one I kind of want to talk about is Dragon Slayer. I mentioned in the honorable mention, and it is an important game, but I'll talk about that a little bit more. I think it's still honorable mention is still probably the place for it, but it was considered the first true action RPG. And you do have to emphasize the word true in that. And that's because there are a lot of games with action RPG elements in them. Going back all the way, I would say, to like Ultima 1 and Rogue. In those games, they are turn-based, but the turns are so quick that you still had to act very quickly in order to use your turn, otherwise it would pass. So it's not like, hey, it's my turn, I can just walk away for a couple hours. Like, you do that, you'll still die. You'll just constantly pass your turns until you're dead. So is that action? Like, no, that's still turns, because they're still turns. And I'm like, well, you look at like Dragon Slayer or even Hydlide, and the attacking mechanic is basically I go, you go, I go, you go. Is that not turns? Well, no, because they're not clearly defined as turns. It's just that attacks take a certain amount of time, and that certain amount of time allows your opponent to also attack you. And I'm like, yeah, but functionally, it's still turn-based. Like even Hydlide, which is much more action-based, I would say, than Dragon Slayer. Dragon Slayer, it's still very much a grid pattern. It's still, you attack, the enemies do move on, they move at kind of a set speed that could be considered a turn, right? It's difficult to define it. And once you start getting into the real nitty gritty of everything, especially in 1984, take all the genre titles with a grain of salt, because at the end of the day, they're like in 1984, there's not a lot of genres. They mostly just go with either action, adventure, maybe strategy, and maybe RPG. Like that's about it. Like we can say, and the other one that I want to talk about is fighting. We call them a fighting game now, but back in the day, it would probably just be called action. Sports also would be a genre, but let's look at like the fighting genre. Could you really point out to me why Punch-Out is not considered a fighting game as opposed to Yi Ar Kung Fu or Karate Champ? Like Karate Champ versus Punch-Out. Why is Karate Champ, which is still a sport in which it's a one-on-one competition, why is that considered a fighting game? Which is with Punch-Out, it's considered a sports game, even though it's still a one-on-one fight. Like, they're very loose definitions, and is kind of my point. And then we got fighting versus beat 'em up. Why is Kung Fu Master, where I go to the side, basically defeating enemies as I go, versus Karateka. Why is Kung Fu Master, God, I'm getting a lot of these names confused. Why is Kung Fu Master considered a beat 'em up, but Karateka, where I go to the right, defeating enemies as I go, considered a fighting game, right? They're very loose, and a lot of these games at the time are going to blur that line a ton, to the point that I don't think genre is a huge deal in 1984, which is why I haven't talked about genre too much. I just kind of bring up, like, it's considered by many to be this, but you can't really define them at the time. I would argue that it's hard to have those kinds of definitions. So when it comes to, Dragon Slayer, once again, being the first true action RPG, like, why is the Tower of Jiraga? Is it because it's an arcade game? Doesn't have experience levels? Like, which particular thing doesn't fit into your category? But at the time, those genres didn't exist, really. People were just trying to make kind of games that would be popular, and people assign genres to them after the fact. So they're very difficult to define. In 1984, I still have decided not to do genre-based titles or genre-based awards, I should say. So I'm not going to talk about like best RPG of the year, best fighting game of the year. I don't think we're ready for that yet. I'll reassess that at the end of 1985. Maybe we're going to get there, but 1984, definitely not. Like the Ghostbusters game, what genre does that fill in? Is it an action game? Well, it has action elements. Is it a strategy game? Well, it's got strategic elements. Is it an adventure game? You could say that. Like, which genre is it really in? I think it's ultimately considered action, but, they're very loose, and you have to look at genres differently in 1984 than you do now. That's kind of my main point. Next up, let's talk about RPGs, right? As I just told you that genres don't necessarily exist. RPGs, the main thing that I want to talk about is kind of the difference between Japan and the Western RPGs. We are starting to see a split in the style of what they're doing. Japan is primarily going more action-based. And once again, I'm not going to call them action RPGs, but they're definitely trying to make them more action-based at the time. They're trying to speed it up. They're trying to not necessarily give you a lot of time to sit and think about your decisions. Whereas in the Western side, you have much more of a turn-based, so to speak, strategy-based RPGs where you get to sit and think about, like, okay, what spell do I want to cast? Who do I want to target? All that kind of stuff is definitely more on the Western side. So that is a change that I want noticed, but once again, don't necessarily read too much into that. It's just that we're starting to see a split, and that is an important thing to notice, is that Japan is definitely doing one form and Western companies are definitely doing another form. That's kind of the main point there. All right. Next thing I want to talk about is consoles. Consoles are starting to go away, and they're much less important than they were in previous years. There's not a lot of console games. I counted that I played 31 games this year, and of those, only 3 were originally released on a console. Those were Pitfall 2, Lost Caverns, Hero, and Excitebike. Those are the only original console titles this year. We're also starting to see less ports to the consoles. It's just not seen as a huge deal to try to release it on a console. And that's because 2 things. One is that the Atari 2600 basically floundering. They stopped making it. They stopped, producing it. They're basically just allowing what's already in stores to sell, but they're not, replenishing that supply. So as a consumer, why would I buy one? Like, unless you severely discount it, like they're not selling new ones. But then as a developer, why would I design for it? Why would I make a game designed for the Atari 2600? You're not even making that anymore. So my audience is limited to who already has one. And if they break, oh well. So your audience is going to shrink for the Atari 2600. Absolutely. The other reason is that the Famicom, which is probably the most promising console by the end of 1984, let's be honest, not probably, but it is promising. It's still only in Japan. It's not selling particularly well. It's getting better, but really you have to have a license from Nintendo to sell on it. So you have to, I believe that the structure was, I'll have to look back in my notes, but I believe the structure was you had to give them like a flat payment and royalties. And that's not something that a lot of companies are willing to do at this point, right? We've talked about just a couple companies taking that contract. So between those, like where are you going to put a console game? So no, we're really talking about arcades and computers at this point, which is why a lot of people say like the crash basically devastated the industry, is that the consoles basically disappeared. Like they're gone. End of 1984, either you've already purchased an Atari 2600 or like you basically don't have that much. Maybe you could get a ColecoVision, We didn't talk about a lot of ColecoVision titles, though, either. Maybe you got an Intellivision, but that's going through some struggles. The console market is essentially gone. And we have to hope that it comes back. Once again, Famicom's promising, but everything else seems to be on the way out. I would also argue that console games are basically still lesser arcade titles. They still are basically an arcade game on a console. Even the original titles, like Excitebike, River Raid comes to mind, Kaboom, Demon Attack, those still very much play... Uh-oh. We have another delivery? Those games still pretty much play like arcade games. Even if they're originals, they still play the same way. You still basically, like, you hit the start button is essentially putting in a quarter. You do a little action, game over, let's see what your score is. Pitfall 2 was the one that changed that, but it wasn't that popular because it was released on the Atari 2600. That was the first one. Oh, you can beat it. You go through the whole thing. That's actually more or less the way you go. You go through the whole thing, you beat the game. Sure, you get a score, but you can beat the game. That's not really a thing that was happening. So ultimately, the console games are still just arcade games, just done a little, more basic because it has to fit on a console. Next up, we have, I want to point out that there really is a big divide between markets, not only by platform, but by region. And I can only talk about region so much, especially when it comes to the computer market. What I'm talking about is there's a huge divide between like the arcade market over here, console market here, computer games like way, way over here. Not only is there a big divide between what an arcade game looks like and to some extent a console game. Once again, console games are just kind of lesser arcade games, so it's like they're there. Like consoles are basically like Arcade Junior, basically at this point. It's not as good as the arcade most of the time. But then you got the computer games like way over here. They're doing something completely different. Look at Elite and the Lords of Midnight. And the RPGs like Hydlide and Dragon Slayer too. Yeah, we'll talk about it. But those games are so different than what is being released on the arcade. You got time to think. You got longer games. You can do what you want. It's not just about defeating the enemy in front of you all the time. There's a lot more. Computer games are getting larger and longer in scope. I wrote primarily British computer games, and British computer games is where a lot of innovation is happening. We're seeing not only changes in the genres, we're seeing blends of the genres, we're seeing technical improvements in like Lords of Midnight and in Elite and in all those kinds of things. We're seeing those changes happen in terms of exploring new ways to play games, in terms of even Night Lore technically had some technical advancements. Night Lore. But they're making the improvements in the British computer game market. The thing is that those British computer games often don't see an American release at all. And it's really difficult for me to gauge what is released in America when it comes to the British computer games, because there is a Commodore 64 market in England and in Europe. So if they say they released it on the Commodore 64, sometimes that means that it was just released in Europe for the Commodore 64, and sometimes that means that there was an American release as well for the Commodore 64. So I can't even tell you which games are released in these different regions right now. Especially with computer games in particular, there is not a lot of information on release dates for computer at the time in 1984. A lot of these companies are very small. The developers are still just like one or two guys, and they're just like searching for somebody to publish it, and hopefully it works out, right? So the British computer games, the American computer games, they do play differently, but I can't necessarily, in terms of who made them, but I can't necessarily tell you if there's a kind of a cross-pollination, so to speak, of whether certain games got released in certain regions. But you can definitely tell the difference in the developers and the publishers and what they're trying to do. And once again, still kind of focusing on British computer games. And then Japanese computer games. Well, I should talk about Japanese computer games a bit. Japanese computer games, right? They have their own platforms. We're talking the PC-88. We're talking the MSX. We're talking a couple other things that I haven't really talked about, like Sharp X7. I think there's something called Dragon something. But there's a lot of Japanese computers going on at the time, and those don't transfer. So, like, if there's an MSX game that was released in Japan, chances are it doesn't get released in America at all. There's a few games that we'll talk about. The only one I think that we played this time was Hydlide, where it didn't get an American release. It was only released in Japan. If I say it was released for Japanese computers, it's because it's only on Japanese computers, right? And I will eventually try to talk about when those do get released in America and stuff like that. But for the most part, they don't. They just don't. Okay. So British computer games, technical marvels, and they're larger and longer in scope. But at the same time, British video game journalism is way too positive. Way too positive. If you thought that, like, I especially with like Underworld and Night Lore, like, oh, those games were bad, you should see the games that I said no to. Those get rave reviews. They typically use like a percent or like an out of 100. A lot of these games are getting over 90s, and I'm still not even talking about them, let alone playing them. The British video game journalism is way too positive. I believe that Underworld got like a 94, like way too high. Lots of games are decent or okay for the time. I would still argue Underworld is not, but they get rave reviews from the journalists, and I don't understand. I already did try to temper what I was thinking about when it came to the British computer games. I'm going to keep doing that. Like, just because you got like over a 90% doesn't mean I'm going to play you. I'm trying to temper that further. I have lists. We'll talk about that when we get to 1985. But in terms of what I'm looking at when it comes to British video games, I'm taking everything that they say and, you know, kind of just going, well, let me take a look. Like, oh, this got a 97 or a 95. But it feels like their rating goes from like 80 to 95. Like, they start at 80%. So, once again, I kind of temper what they say and try to do that. But keep in mind that, God, it is high. That's something I learned this year. Just, that is not how good this game is. You guys are far too positive. I had to look to see if those magazines were actually from like the computer companies themselves, or somebody that was paid for by the computer company. Just like, are you guys, accepting bribes? Like, why are you so positive about these games? As far as I can tell, they're not, but we're talking almost 40 years ago in England. I probably don't have all the information. So that's something. Next thing that I want to talk about, like we talked about before, keep in mind that I'm judging games based on their original releases. I'm giving them a modern review, but I'm really only looking at the originals. Several games we talked about this year had, I'd put, disastrous ports. Those in particular, off the top of my head, would be Tower of Jiraga, Ghostbusters, and Hydlide. Those ports, unfortunately, would be the versions that are most well known. And so, like, we'll talk about why that is. I don't want to spoil things. Maybe at the end of 1985 I'll talk about that. But those ports are bad and well known. We'll cover the ports, but keep in mind that a bad port doesn't mean a bad game. Like, the original doesn't necessarily have to be bad just because there's a bad port. Next thing is that we're paying a little closer attention to Nintendo than other companies. That's for a reason, not just because their games are high quality and popular. They are. I do try to temper that, but we are paying a little bit closer attention to Nintendo than we probably would other companies. I've had a couple requests to pay more attention to other companies the same way that I do Nintendo, but there's a reason that Nintendo's kind of special. And I think everybody kind of knows why that is. But for now, Nintendo, I'll put it this way. One of the reasons is that Nintendo is very self-referential. They talk about their older stuff a lot. Like in Punch-Out, how you could see Donkey Kong Jr., Mario, and Luigi in the audience. That kind of thing happens a ton in Nintendo. And so even if the original game wasn't necessarily the most successful, there will be other games that kind of reference it, and it's important to understand that reference to understand that game. That kind of thing. But Nintendo games are high quality. They are popular. They're important. All that kind of stuff. So they normally fit the criteria, but I am paying a little closer attention to Nintendo. Next up, Hudson Soft. They're releasing quite a few games on the Nintendo games as ports on computers in Japan. But those ports are largely forgotten. That's something I learned. I had heard that there were like computer games that were ports of Nintendo games, but I didn't know Hudson Soft was doing it, and I didn't know how many there were. They're doing a ton of those. Next up, something to kind of keep in mind, Hudson Soft, I just talked about that one. America is often being avoided for a lot of international releases. The American video game market is lower than a lot of the other places. So it might not necessarily be worth the time or money for a small British company to try to figure out how to do their release in this large North American market. Is it worth the money? Are people even buying games over there? Japan is feeling the same way. Like we have this Japanese arcade game. It's doing well. Do you want to release it in America? Maybe not, right? You're starting to see some hesitancy. Not every popular video game is getting an American release. At the same time, though, Nintendo in particular has a lot of their games being first released in American arcades as these Versus titles. And we'll talk more about the Versus system as we continue, but all of these Versus titles are essentially conversion ports. You can have the one arcade cabinet that is a Versus system and then just change out the title, change out a couple of the artwork, and there you go, you've got the next game. We're going to delve way more into that in 1985. We'll talk about that more, but the Versus system is one of the most popular systems in America. And Nintendo is kind of slowly gaining popularity in America, where a lot of other Japanese companies aren't really willing to release in America. That's kind of important. Second-party developers. HAL Laboratory is really the most well-known second-party developer, but it's not the first. A second-party developer is when a major company, in this case Nintendo, pays someone else to develop the game to still be released officially by the main company. So Nintendo is paying HAL Laboratory to make these Famicom and arcade games, but it's still being released as a Nintendo game. And that's a second-party developer. We have talked a little bit about that when it came to the, I believe that was the Vectrex. It could have been the Intellivision, though, where Mattel was paying a company to make the game, and it was still being released as a Mattel game. It's not the first time it's come up. It happens a lot behind the scenes, but HAL Laboratory is probably the most famous one that we'll probably ever talk about. Just know that that's kind of how that system works, and we'll keep an eye on that as we continue. Next up, Jack Tramiel. Yeah. Here's what I wrote. With Jack Tramiel at the head, Atari has essentially disappeared from the forefront of the industry, hoping to make a comeback later. Now, it's easy to look at what Jack Tramiel did and just go, what are you doing? Kind of knowing where video games go. But in 1985, let's try to put ourselves in Jack Tramiel's head, see why he's making these decisions. 1984, 1985. Let's talk about it. So, Jack Tramiel came from Commodore. He's a computer guy. He made computers. He made the most successful computer in America, but didn't stick around Commodore enough to really reap the benefits of that. So he is a computer guy, thinks he knows how to make computers. He just didn't like the people around him. Circumstances got him out of the industry, that kind of thing. So he bought Atari because they had computers. That's the real reason he bought it. He probably doesn't really care about consoles or really video games all that much. He bought Atari thinking, I'm going to make the next big computer with your talent. I have the ideas because the Commodore 64 proved that, and I just need to use you guys to make it. All this other stuff we can just get rid of. So I can sell off the arcade market. Who cares about arcades? Consoles, you guys are all fired. Let's postpone. Yeah, the consoles, don't worry about that. I know it's almost done. We'll wait on that. I'm going to make the next big computer with you. That's his mindset. So is it understandable? Maybe. But we're hemorrhaging money. Let's cut our losses. And the console market, you guys made the biggest mistakes in consoles. Those things are just a fad. They're going away. That's his mindset. Atari's basically gone, right? We talked about a couple Atari games, or we talked about Marble Madness, I should say, at the end of 1984 by Atari Games, which is the coin-op division. But essentially the main Atari company, they're gone. And, what does that mean for things like the Sword Quest franchise and the Atari 2600 and the Atari 7800, which was under development and almost done? We'll have to see. But essentially right now, Atari is incognito. They're gone. They're not doing anything anymore. So that's the thing. I also made a note here based on a couple comments that I got. Nobody in particular, but keep in mind, just because a certain company, certain person, certain country, certain platform has a game does not automatically make the game better. It might make the game more important, more influential, but it doesn't make it a better game. So just something to keep in mind. I had a couple just like, well, this is by this company or this is from this country, therefore it's better. And I'm like, that's not how it works. Anyway, all right, almost their own videos this year. Let's talk about that briefly. Basically, there were games that I originally had on my list and I took out. Those are GAPLUS, tennis, pinball, golf, summer games, Beyond Castle Wolfenstein, Wrecking Crew, Dragon Slayer, Clue Clue Land, Super Xevious, Dragon Buster, and Spy vs. Spy. Now, there are reasons kind of individual to each one of these as to why I didn't cover it in its own video and stuff like that. One of which, the one that people really did want to talk about was Dragon Slayer. I'll save most of that for when we talk about later releases, but essentially Dragon Slayer had, people were wanting me to do it, and a couple people said that it was their favorite game of the year. So if you are interested in RPGs and action RPGs, feel free to check out Dragon Slayer, right? Like I said, I think it's a good honorable mention. We'll talk about that more in future videos. I'll put it that way because, at this point, it just kind of feels like I'd be bad-mouthing a game that people really enjoy or went back to. But I will say that I think honorable mention is the right place for it. And I know that, but keep in mind, people disagree with me. We're going to have disagreements like that. But Dragon Slayer, if you're interested, probably worth checking out, at least a video or, an analysis or something like that. We'll talk about it more, though, in future videos, believe it or not. It makes sense to talk about it then. All right, let's get into awards. Awards, once again, I considered in 1984 doing genre-based awards, but I decided against it. It's just not there yet. We'll start with kind of just culture as a whole. My favorite TV show. My favorite TV show, it took me a while to find something. And looking over my list, they're all cartoons. I'm not a huge fan of TV in the early to mid 80s, to be honest. Nothing really captivates me. But ultimately, I give it to Muppet Babies. Yay, I liked Muppet Babies. I really liked it when I was a kid. I think I went back and saw a couple episodes. I'm like, it's good. I understand the references more, but it's okay. Honorable mentions, Fraggle Rock, Transformers, Snorks, Inspector Gadget, Fist of the North Star, Doraemon, and Urusei Yatsura. They're all decent shows. Like they're important, but not necessarily my favorite. Like I said, they're all right. They're good. Next up, we have my favorite movie. Favorite movie this year, Ghostbusters. Easily. I really do like Ghostbusters. I'm not a huge fan, as big as a lot of other people are, but I still really like it. Like it's a solid film. It's really good. I recommend everybody should at least watch Ghostbusters once. It's good. Other honorable mentions, Police Academy. I forgot that made the list. That's mostly because I watched it as a kid. I loved Michael Winslow, who actually shares a birthday with me. He did all the sounds and stuff. That guy's awesome. It's a funny, well, at least it was funny. I haven't gone back and watched it. It probably did not age well at all, but I liked it growing up. Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. This is Spinal Tap. The Never-Ending Story. Terminator. A Nightmare on Elm Street. And 1984. Not ironically released in 1984. Not all of them end up with video games. I should mention, now's probably a good time for it, just because it's culturally significant doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to talk about it in my cultural world video. I really only am talking about the popular things and then things that either influence or basically have a video game based on it. Like if it influenced video games or if they made video games on it, I'll mention it in the honorable mentions, but that doesn't mean those are the only films and only TV shows that are culturally significant. So, for instance, this is Spinal Tap, The Never-Ending Story, in 1984. Culturally significant. I'm a fan of them. They don't make video games on This is Spinal Tap. They didn't make a 1984 video game based on the film, at least. They made so many video games. As far as I remember, they didn't make something on The Never-Ending Story. I'd have to look, but I don't know. Anyway, we'll move on from that. Next up is the most disappointing game. This one's easy. It's Underworld. Underworld. Arguably the worst game that we have played to date. Way worse than E.T. Way worse. Not a fan. Don't understand how people liked it at the time. But people said they liked it at the time. If it wasn't by Ultimate Play of the Game, and it wasn't like a direct entry in the series right before Nightlore, I probably wouldn't have talked about it at all. Game that aged the worst. I gave that to Nightlore. Nightlore was considered one of the best games of all time. Today, I would argue that it is an exercise in frustration. And granted, I didn't do the puzzles the way that I was supposed to. It technically is possible to beat it, but man, it would take so much time that you would basically have to have the entire game memorized before you booted it up in order to beat the game. And that's not where you want to be. Favorite console? Consoles are disappearing. So at this point, as of like December 31st, 1984, favorite console is the ColecoVision. It's not by a lot either, but it has access to all the Atari 2600 games. It has access to better versions of a lot of arcade ports. So I got to give it to the ColecoVision. The Famicom is getting close, but even if I spoke Japanese, I still would probably say the ColecoVision is better as of this date. The Famicom's getting close. It's getting better. It's got better versions of most of the games, but it just doesn't have a lot of games. So I'll probably still give it to the ColecoVision at this point. Favorite console game? Like I said, we only have 3. So there's not a lot for me to talk about. I gave it to Excitebike. It's good. I like it. It's not my favorite game of the year by a long shot, but it's a fun racing game. It's not my favorite by a lot over Pitfall 2, Lost Caverns to Hero. Probably between those two, if between the other two, Pitfall 2 was better for me, but Excitebike this year, I think that was the better game. Favorite arcade game? I did give it to Tower of Jiraga. No, there we go. The Tower of Jiraga, that's a fun game. I wish I could do better at it. Get all the secrets, make it all the way to the top. Of all the arcade games, that's the one I want to go back to the most, so I'm not surprised to see it here. Honorable mentions, 1942, I really do like that game. Marble Madness, it's fun, but it's short. And then Punch-Out. Punch-Out, mostly because of its importance, but it's also fun. It's a fun boxing game. So That's it. All right. Favorite computer game. This one's the toughest one. Ultimately, I gave it to King's Quest. King's Quest is the best game for me this year. No surprises. Spoilers, favorite game, King's Quest as well. But it's kind of been computer games for a while. King's Quest, I think, was a big change. And granted, it's a small change compared to what Sierra had been doing in some of the other titles that we had seen from them, like Mystery House, Wizard and the Princess, I think Time Zone. I can't remember some of the other names, but we had already seen the graphics with the text-based adventure game below it. King's Quest allowed you to also move a sprite on the screen, and that's a huge change. It's small, but it makes a huge difference, and I think that huge difference makes it a lot better. I think it was fun. I think it was funny. I think that the puzzles were good, although, you know, puzzles at the time, there's always going to be like one or two that just kind of stand out. Well, that was really hard. But ultimately, it had the story. Like everything that I like in video games, I think King's Quest did the best. Some honorable mentions. Lords of Midnight, that was a really good game. It's just that it needed more development that, you know, granted, one guy probably couldn't do. Elite had the potential, but once again, if they just did those two fixes, you give me the controls, you don't make me dock, that probably would have been the best game of the year. It might have been King's Quest, like I would have had, but I would have had to play it for several hours before I could decide. But Elite would have been up there in contention with those two fixes. I put Hydlide here. Hydlide, my favorite RPG of the year. It gets an honorable mention. I think that the balance issues really knocked it down, but I had a lot of fun with the combat and the exploration and the puzzle solving and all that kind of stuff. Hydlide is a fun game. Like, feel free to check it out. Maybe find a cheat to give you max level, though. Like, then you'll be fine. Ghostbusters was a fun game as well. I think, once again, that gets a little bit more flack than it deserves because of a bad port. It was fun, but it just became too repetitive by the end, and I couldn't quite figure out the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Once again, I'm getting conflicting information, even now, about how to do that. Then, finally, Tetris. Tetris, you gotta put Tetris on the list as at least an honorable mention. I think by 1984, it's not the best game. I think there's a lot that still needs to be worked on to make that better. But I mean, at the end of the day, they're all small tweaks, but things that can be improved on in Tetris. Knowing where it goes held it back, but ultimately the game is one of the best puzzle games of all time and deserves to be at least mentioned. So Tetris is an honorable mention, but I still like King's Quest better, especially in 1984. What other people did? Other awards that were given out by other companies at the time. A couple people are a little behind. So the Arcade Awards, they gave the best game of the year to an arcade game, shockingly. They gave it to the Star Wars arcade game, which isn't too surprising. That was a lot of fun. It's from a big franchise. It's officially licensed. It feels like Star Wars. No surprises there. I think the Tower of Druaga is better than the Star Wars arcade game, but that's just me. Next up, we have Computer Gamer. Computer Gamer gave best game of the year to Elite. Like I said, surprised that people were surprised that I played that one. Computer Gamer, I think, made a good call. Not necessarily the best call, but Elite is a good game. It was just too frustrating for me, and that might be because I'm a modern gamer. But maybe at the time, Elite was, more fun than King's Quest, but I enjoyed King's Quest. And then Golden Joystick. Now, Golden Joystick is British computer games only, but they gave it to Nightlore. That's one of the reasons that I put it on most disappoint or aged the worst. It's like people at the time really loved it. They really loved Nightlore. I did not, but they gave it there. Once again, British computer games only. From that, if it's just a British computer game, I probably give it to Lords of Midnight, to be honest. It was really good. I really enjoyed it. All right, so next up, let's talk about a list of patrons. I do want to thank you guys for being a patron. I have had Patreon for a while now, so let's give a shout out to the patrons. I have my list here. I have to make sure that I don't pick people that aren't here anymore. But thank you to Sean Armstrong, Marcus N., Gibbous Wearing Brony. Did you give me a name for you? Some people said they wanted a different name. No, you didn't. So Gibbous Wearing Brony. Then we got Issa, Strawberry System, Alex Jones, Veronica Gross, Squirrel Dash, Isaiah Olson, Daniel, Joe B, Mike Lindgren. Thank you guys. Once again, I do have Patreon. I don't like advertising it too much, but links always in the description if you guys do want to support the channel. There's not a lot of benefits to it. It's more just if you want to support the channel, but you'll get early access to videos. More or less all of them are going to be a week in advance. The one exception is actually this video, which they get to contribute to, but they also don't get access to it too much earlier than everybody else. But that is something that is available if you guys are interested. All right, with that said, let's get to the patron contributions. Let me make sure I have my list here in front of me. So I asked everybody what they thought of the year. These are the responses that I got. From Strawberry System, I will admit that this may have been the best year we have encountered thus far. One game I kind of looked forward to because of nostalgia was the Ghostbusters tie-in, but I will admit that it got pretty boring and repetitive for my taste. I had high hopes for Night Lore as well, but it turned out to be pretty much impossible to complete. I did like most of the other stuff, however, with special praise in my personal Game of the Year awards going to King's Quest: Quest for the Crown. Then we have Issa. Issa says, once again, I have no childhood memories connected to any of this, but I played 2 of the games last year, King's Quest and Dragon Slayer, which was an honorable mention. Out of these, I give my Game of the Year award to King's Quest for its interesting mechanics, funny deaths, and for the fact that the true final boss of this game is not a monster or a dragon or a demon, but simply gravity. It was funny and a little frustrating at once, but definitely made it memorable. The second one, Dragon Slayer, was impossible for me to skip as I am a bit of a Falcom fangirl. I couldn't skip the start of the series that is most important to its early history. I played a subsequent release of it for a future console. I'll say it's the Falcom Classics version in 1997. So I can't obviously comment on how the original was to play. On modern standards, the remake felt like a pretty normal action arcade-inspired gameplay loop without any particular point of interest, but at least we were able to finish it in a few hours and without too many issues, so I have a mostly positive view on it. Since we played this game, we decided to skip on Hydlide, which is the second competitor for this genre early on, and seeing it, I think we made the right choice in the end as it seems to be an even slower and not particularly brilliant to play. Slightly off topic, but while Punch-Out and its sequel are not my genre and I have no interest in trying them, I did get pretty invested in its speedrun competition history as they are incredibly precise and require almost insane reflexes and also a bit of luck. It's a pretty impressive feat to witness. Also still not my genre, but I thought Karate Champ was pretty cute. Solid year, and I think we can only get better from here. Yeah, I agree. Dragon Slayer, like I said, especially if you're playing the 1997 version, it's probably a better game than Hydlide. But Hydlide 1984, way more important, and they're very similar. All right, next we have Demi. 1984 is a year that comes off as very important for the video game scene as a whole. While games were constantly developing and evolving throughout all years up till now, I feel like this year and the games we looked at proved what games can really be besides a few shapes and lines moving across the screen, even more so than 1983 had already done. The sheer amount of memorable games, too, is proof of how the industry was evolving and would continue to evolve into later years. This is also the year from which I've played a few games myself, even having owned Duck Hunt as a kid despite being from a later era than 1984. We'll talk about that. Between games like Punch-Out and its super version, Ice Climber, Excite Bike, Boulder Dash, Hydlide, and the aforementioned Duck Hunt, we begin to see new and different ways of developing games, with the appearance of new and interesting genres that would last, in some cases, to this day as some of the most popular. We also see some more develops on already established types of games, like Sorcerer or The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which continue to bring us text adventure games, and Ultimate Play the game's continued innovation in the use of perspective and other mechanics that not many other studios thought to or perhaps dared to go into. We also see games diverge from the classic use of manuals to develop the game's plot, instead using admittedly simpler summaries inserted into the game itself, like what is seen with Kung Fu Master or The Lord of Midnight's more visual storytelling. That is something I did not talk about. That is correct. However, I must personally give my highlights to King's Quest for showing us a completely different and much more interactive version of what Sierra had been doing up to this point. And Dragon Slayer, which, despite not getting its own episode, was a game I played and enjoyed quite a bit despite its simplicity. Highlights, though similar, seems, as mentioned, a lot grindier and therefore easier to get bored of, not that that's a fault specific to it. Within this incredibly exciting year, it's hard to pick a game that's clearly the best, and we start to see more of a tendency towards different tastes pleasing different people. Of course, not everyone agreed on the game of the year even before this, but now we begin to see incredible games in many different genres and styles, to the point where it becomes hard to decide. In the end, I'll personally have to give my award to King's Quest, as its form of storytelling and great combination of Sierra's environments with a more interactive form of playing the game, with the ability to actually move around in what before felt more akin to paintings that you'd flip through, carries not only a gameplay experience unlike anything else so far, but also one that has a certain charm to it that, despite its aged graphics and very strict and slow movement, makes it a game that is easy to play and enjoy even to this day. Unlike a lot of other games that, while still holding up to this day, have other alternatives that will be seen later on that are clearly better versions, there isn't much that is exactly like King's Quest, and thus it's a special experience that has become dear in my heart after playing it. I'm excited for 1985, for more games that I've been able to experience recently, and to see the development of the companies we see, with eyes being kept especially on Nintendo and Falcom, two companies I'm very fond of. Thank you, as always, for bringing these games to a wider audience and for being a source of entertainment and learning, and we'll keep looking forward to more. Yeah, lots of good points there. Definitely. All right, then we have Joe B. Joe B says, first off, my condolences on your expeditions in the brutal Ghostbusters, Underworld, and Nightlore games. They certainly don't make them like they used to. That's a good thing. My favorite game that came out this year was the one game that truly surpassed the test of time, the perfect game, Tetris. Nothing else compares. It's so universal that it feels more like it was discovered, not invented. I still think 84 was not a great year of gaming progression, but there were some good standouts: Punch-Out!, The Lords of Midnight, Elite, Kung Fu Master, and Karateka, as games that also really pushed the medium. Looking forward to next year, where a certain Fire-Breathing Turtle debuts. Fire-Breathing Turtle? That doesn't make any sense. Turtles are ocean-based. What are you talking about? Then we have Gibbous Wearing Brownie. I'd say that wrong every time. I apologize. Gibbous Wearing Brownie. I'm frustrated with Atari. They keep making bad decisions in their effort to recover from the crash. Why make the new replacement to the 2600 sound so similar to the original when the previous replacement failed because it suffered the same problem? Why delay the 7800 when the goal is to launch a new computer as soon as possible? Why keep supporting the old system when it's killing them? I don't understand what the new management is thinking. He's making a lot of bad decisions. Like, putting it in his mindset like I did, it helps a bit, but yeah, they're bad decisions. Anyway, rant aside, this year was the biggest year yet for video gaming, and developments seem extremely promising, both on a technical level and in terms of game design. Nintendo is the new rising star, RPG and fighting games are maturing, and the overall look, feel, and sound of the games this year are, I dare I say it, reaching the point where they're actually good. I have some scattered thoughts about particular things I wanted to share here, so in no particular order. I'm pretty confident now that this year contained the best Atari 2600 game ever to release, though I'm not sure whether that game is Pitfall 2 or Hero. I would agree with that. I liked Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom much better than I was expecting to. It is now my favorite Indiana Jones film. Thanks for giving it a spotlight. Like I said, some people like Temple of Doom better. Like they're good movies. I'm not sure exactly how this will play out, but I'm convinced that the eventual downfall of text adventure games, and possibly adventure games in general, is because too many people took the wrong lessons from the Hitchhiker's Guide game. The game's puzzles were goofy and unintuitive, but that's because that's appropriate to the source material. And they work because the game gives you real clues as to what to do next. The Babelfish puzzle in particular, despite its reputation, was actually fairly easy to follow. However, I suspect future games in this genre tried to recapture the fun of this title's goofy, unintuitive puzzles very bluntly, without as much care for the game design or the humor, producing too many use X on Y Rube Goldberg machines that are neither solvable nor funny. However, I'm not as familiar with the genre as we will eventually become through this series, so I'll just have to wait to see if my theory pans out. It's an interesting theory. I'm not going to comment on it. I've actually become quite the fan of the Pac-Man animated series, having watched both seasons and the Christmas special since I first watched your video about the show. It bums me out that a little that it was canceled, but it was nonetheless very gratifying to see its material canonized in Pac-Land, and I imagine fans at the time felt the same. The show is quite good if you like classic cartoons, so I'd definitely recommend giving it a shot if you or any of your viewers brushed it off. I did watch it. It does feel like early 80s animation. So if you are a fan of that, if you do like it, you'll probably like the Pac-Man show. I'm not as big of a fan of it, so like it just was another on the list for me. But it's good. And yeah, if it's good for the time, and if you enjoy that kind of thing, go and check it out. Like it's not bad by any means. All right. Finally, if I may, this is all fine. I'd like to shout out some of my favorite music from 1984. Purple Rain, Born in the USA, and to a lesser extent, Like a Virgin, were the defining albums of the year and all have great singles. Summer of '69 by Bryan Adams is a guilty pleasure. Metallica's Ride the Lightning is a great metal record if you're into that. Rock You Like a Hurricane is easily the best hair metal of the year. And Freedom is Wham's peak, though I'm not sure I can recommend the politically awkward music video. In fact, now that I think about it, just listen to their entire album, Make It Big, from this year instead of any of the three I mentioned at the start of this tangent. It's very fun. All that aside, though, I think my pick for best song of the year, since I can't decide a best game, would be 99 Luftballons by, I think it's Nina? It's been a while. It straddles the line between the moment's Reagan-fueled optimism and the looming threat of the Cold War like nothing else did that year. Here's to 1985. I have thought about talking about music more, so talking about music is perfectly fine. I just can't play clips on YouTube, like, at all. I think they flag me if I even put 5 seconds, because I was originally told 10. I can get away with 10 for, like, movies, but 5 seconds for music, which often isn't enough time to even, like, for the singer to sing a whole sentence. So I can't talk about music, but, like, we could. Like, I don't have a problem with it, because music of the time is evolving, and music will influence video game music, and sometimes video games entirely. So I have no problem with music. It's just that because of the platform I'm on, I can't talk about it as much as I would like. All right, last bit here. Let's look ahead to 1985. 1985 is a big year. I've had a couple people already tell me that they feel 1985 is actually the first true year of video game history, that everything just kind of starts in 1985. Obviously, I disagree, but that kind of emphasizes how important this year is going to be. It is our biggest year to date. Our previous biggest year was 1982, if memory serves me correctly, right before the crash. 1985, I believe, is bigger than that right now in terms of number of topics I need to cover. Right now, I'm looking at over 50 different topics. I'm trying to narrow that down as I go through it. I try to be a little bit more lenient when I start, and then when I revisit it, when I actually write scripts and stuff, then, some of that gets eliminated. So right now I'm looking at over 50. That number might dip below 50, but let's just assume 50 different topics. It's big. It's big. More variety is coming, new subgenres, more balance in types of games. It's not just going to be, oh, here's one RPG for the year. There's going to be more balance to that kind of thing. We're going to see some new genres, more variety. All that is exciting. We are going to see a lot of computer games. Computer games are still big. There are particularly a lot of British computer games. Those are kind of some of the ones that I'm knocking off my list as we go, though. But the British computer games are still very influential. They're very important. It's an industry that is booming in 1984 and 1985. So expect that. The industry is just very strong over there. There's so many honorable mentions, just so many. Those videos are just getting longer and longer. So I'm still doing it by quarter. I think that's the way to go right now. As we get to the future, we might have to do them by month. But 1985, still by quarter, is the way to go. There's going to be a big shakeup in the industry in 1985. Some people already know what I'm talking about. A lot of people already know what I'm talking about. But companies and platforms are going to revolutionize the industry, and we'll talk about that. We have some very big name games coming this year, including starts of franchises that last to this day. That's going to be important. So that's kind of looking ahead to 1985. Let's talk a little bit about some behind the scenes. I forgot to talk about this earlier, but it's kind of good to mention it now. So for kind of me personally, if you're wondering about what things have been happening, what things are going to happen. Right now, I am very busy. 2 videos a week is pretty much capped for me. That's how much I can do. Maybe in the future, I'll be able to do more. I'm trying to balance things out so that I can. In terms of streaming right now is still canceled, unfortunately. I'm working on ways to be able to do streaming more, but I don't want to really jinx it by talking about it too much. But the ultimate result right now is that I need to be in a physical office doing a job until basically 5 p.m. And then it takes me about an hour to get home at the end of the night. By then, I'm usually fairly tired. And 6 p.m. Pacific time is not the best time for me to start like a 2-hour stream. So right now streaming is not really in the cards. Hopefully that changes over time. In terms of the channel itself, I have recently made some changes. I tried to hire a channel manager on Fiverr. That was a bad decision. Fiverr is 0 for 3 for me, and I probably will never go back. But I tried to hire a channel manager to try to do things like titles, descriptions, tags, stuff like that to try to help get the channel's popularity up, just to try to get the name out there. As far as I can tell, people that show up and stick around, they like what I'm doing, but I just can't get enough people to show up. So after that kind of failed experiment, which was maybe a couple weeks ago, I've decided to start basically just doing that for myself. I have a system that I use that is basically a combination of vidIQ and ChatGPT, and I just feed the subtitles into ChatGPT, copy paste those with some changes to YouTube, and then let vidIQ tell me if it's good or not, and then kind of work from there. I'm already starting to see some benefits of that, so maybe the channel will be growing. Fingers crossed. I've been doing this project for, I think I did about 3 years. Went back and redid all the videos, so I'm pretty sure it's about 3 years. It will improve. That's my goal. My ultimate goal is honestly to get a full-time editor by the year 1990. I would like, kind of brighten things up for the new decade, get a different style and stuff like that in there. And we'll see what it takes to get there. But, if the channel, spoilers, the channel makes me about $20 a month. If the channel continues to only make me $20 a month, I can't really pay an editor like $500-600 a month to edit the videos. So we'll have to see what that takes. And so that's what we're kind of looking forward to in the future. That's kind of behind the scenes stuff. I'm trying to answer comments more. I kind of always say that. Maybe I'll do some more tweets and Instagram posts and stuff like that in the future. But right now, time is limited. So that's what has been going on behind the scenes type of thing. Hopefully you guys do enjoy the content. Liking, sharing, subscribing, all that kind of stuff really does help. Comments do help. You feel free to always do that. Once again, I do have the Patreon going. I try not to advertise too much as I wear a shirt with my name on it. The big thing is I honestly hope that you actually enjoy the content. And the content really isn't going to change no matter what like the window dressing is. Maybe I'll find somebody that says, no, you really need to change your thumbnails. So maybe the thumbnails will change, titles might change, descriptions, tags, but the videos themselves will not change. I like how I'm doing it and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we got the big year coming up. Hopefully you guys do enjoy it. The biggest year to date. And I hope to see you in 1985. Thanks for watching.